Today's verse is from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 8, verses 25 through 27. The disciples went to Jesus and woke him up. "Lord," they cried, "save us. We're going to die." He asked them, "Why are you afraid? You have little faith." Then he got up and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a great calm. The men were amazed. "What kind of man is this?" they asked. "Even the winds and the sea obey him." There is something extremely awesome about being in a safe place on the seashore and observing the sky suddenly change from blue to black as, from your vantage point, you can see the whole horizon being changed by a gathering storm. The wind suddenly grows louder and swifter, and the waves come deeper into the shore, and with all the whitecaps crashing onto one another, you feel like you're observing something just magnificent. When I observe such a sight, I always think of God's words to Job in the Old Testament, when the Lord finally appears to him after all of his questioning in Job chapter 38. Then the Lord spoke to Job out of the storm. He said, "Who is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man, and I will question you, and you shall answer me. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? On what were its footings set? Or who laid its cornerstone, while the morning stars sang together, and all the angels shouted for joy? Who shut up the sea behind the doors, and when it burst forth from the womb, when I made the clouds its garment and wrapped it in thick darkness, when I fixed limits for it and set its doors and bars in place, when I said, 'This far you may come, and no farther, here is where your proud waves will halt.'" Job responds by feeling put in his place. But that's a good thing, because his place, and ours too, is to know that God is present and is still in control. Just like the words to that old song, "I hope you feel small when you stand beside the ocean." Of course, there is sometimes much to fear about a gathering storm. Recall how the 2020 hurricane season began early when Arthur formed on May 16th? The extremely active season quickly went through the predetermined list of 21 names, ending with Wilfred on September 18th. Then, for only the second time in history, the Greek alphabet was used for the remainder of the season, with Hurricane Alpha forming the same day. In one of the storms, the 2-mile-long bridge across the coast in Pensacola Beach, which was blown out, is still in disrepair. A path of destruction was left across much of the southern United States. We don't know the wisdom of the power of God, which we call Mother Nature, but we must stand in reverent fear and sometimes genuine fright of the power on display when the winds blow and the torrents come down. I always watch in amazement as the storm chasers appear on the evening news to report about the storms when they occur. These people who report the weather have the dangerous and important job of telling others how and when to flee to safety, all the while they're standing in the strong winds, telling us about the magnitude of the storm. Here are a couple recent examples of what I'm talking about.
The wind is so bad here in Desert Hot Springs that it even knocked, oh my God! Oh my God! I don't know! Shut up, it's not funny! The wind is so bad here in Desert Hot Springs that it even caused a street, what is this called? Ah! Literally! Ow! Ah! Okay, ready? So bad here in Palm Springs that it caused this stoplight to break!
This is the brunt of it. This is as bad as it will get right here, right? But literally in minutes, storm that's more parallel. Oh! Well, that could end up being about the longest 15 minutes of my life.
Our Bible lesson for today finds the disciples having gotten into a boat with Jesus when a violent storm suddenly begins. They're afraid for their lives while Jesus sleeps in the bow of the boat. I've read from the book of Matthew, but this story also appears in the Gospels of Mark and Luke. The story is likely familiar to us. Jesus tells his disciples that they're going to go to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, and while they are crossing, a huge storm comes up and threatens to sink the boat. Amazingly, Jesus is asleep on a pillow in the bottom of the boat. The disciples awake Jesus and plead with him to do something. "Don't you care if we drown?" they cry out. Jesus rebukes the storm and says to the wind and the waves, "Quiet, be still." And at once the storm dies down and it's completely calm. The disciples were terrified even after the sea was calm and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." Admittedly, this was a great miracle, but they had already seen him heal people of various diseases, including leprosy, make a paralyzed man walk, restore a man's shriveled hand, and even drive out demons. Why were they terrified enough in this case to say, "Who is this?" What about this act by Jesus to calm the storm convinced them that this rabbi that they were following was without a doubt the Son of God? I'd say that this event took place specifically to remind the disciples of what we have already remembered about Job, and perhaps also to remind them about what we've read in recent weeks about God parting the Red Sea to save the Israelites, and about God creating the oceans and separating the waters from the dry land. This is a timely reminder that God is in control, and also, by the way, don't forget that Jesus is God in the flesh. The importance of this lesson for our time is the question Jesus asks of the disciples when they wake him. Jesus asks, "Why are you afraid?" And I'd like for us to ponder this question in our fearful days. The prolific and profound Christian author Max Lucado has written about a living parable which he observed one day as he sat by a swimming pool in a hotel waiting for inspiration. This video will be fun to watch as I share this story because it's so similar to what Lucado describes he actually saw the day that he wrote this. A father and his two small daughters are at play. He's in the water, and they jump into his arms. "Let me restate that," he says. One jumps, and the other ponders. The dry one gleefully watches her sister leap. She dances up and down as the other splashes, but when her dad invites her to do the same, she shakes her head and backs away. How many people spend life on the edge of the pool, consulting caution, ignoring faith, never taking the plunge, happy to experience life vicariously through others, preferring to take no risk rather than any risk. For fear of the worst, they never enjoy life at its best. By contrast, their sister jumps, not with foolish abandon, but with belief in the goodness of a father's heart and trust in a father's arms. Such was the choice of Jesus. He did more than speak about fear. He faced it. As followers of God, you and I have a huge asset. We know everything is going to turn out all right. Yes, the storms of life will rock our boat, but never forget that Jesus is in the boat. Christ hasn't budged from his throne, and Romans 8:28 hasn't evaporated from the Bible. And we know, the Apostle Paul writes, that in all things God works for good, for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Our problems have always been his possibilities. The kidnapping of Joseph in the Bible resulted in the preservation of his family. The persecution of Daniel in the lion's den led to a cabinet position. Christ entered the world by a surprise pregnancy and redeemed it through his unjust murder. I think that Jesus wanted to teach all of his disciples that stormy day in the wave-tossed boat that no disaster is ultimately fatal to a person of faith. Lucado points out that there are real fears born of legitimate concerns in life, yet left unchecked, they metastasize into obsessions. The step between prudence and paranoia is a short and a small step. Prudence wears a seatbelt. Paranoia avoids cars. Prudence washes with soap. Paranoia avoids contact. Prudence saves for old age. Paranoia hoards even trash. Prudence prepares and plans. Paranoia panics. Prudence calculates the risk and takes the plunge. Paranoia never gets into the water. Speaking about fears and frightfulness, I found myself wondering, and so I looked up a list recently of phobias, things like paranoia, that are listed in psychiatric journals. Phobias are one of the most common mental illnesses in the United States. The National Institute of Mental Health suggests that 8% of us have some type of a phobia. The American Psychiatric Association identifies 4 different categories of phobias: fear of the natural environment, fears of animals, fears related to medical treatments or issues, and fears related to specific situations. Looking at such a list suggests that almost any object or situation can become the source of fear. Acrophobia is the fear of heights. I'm going to try to pronounce this. Hippopotamonstrosquipopedifolia phobia. It's the fear of long words. Ephibiophobia is the fear of teenagers. And coulrophobia, it's the fear of clowns. There's also a phobophobia, which is a fear of phobias. Phobias can be a serious impact on well-being, but it's important to remember that you are not alone. Phobias are common, but they're also clinically treatable. It may be that you already recognized the title for today's message as being from our national past, Fear Itself. That was when Franklin Delano Roosevelt was sworn in as the 32nd President of the United States, March the 4th, 1933. He said that as a part of his inaugural address that day. The nation was in the midst of an economic crisis unmatched in history, nearly 4 years into the Great Depression, and with unemployment hovering near 25%. Americans faced not only a depression of the economy, but also a depression of spirit. And Roosevelt recognized this. He recognized that the former was intrinsically linked to the latter, and tasked himself with reviving the country's soul as well as the country's economy. Throughout his campaign, Roosevelt alluded to this crisis of spirit, offering a wide grin and optimistic rhetoric and a campaign song that declared, "Happy days are here again," as an antidote to the country's anemic psyche. After taking the oath of office, Roosevelt delivered the first of one of many of his memorable speeches as president. Within the opening minutes of his address, he uttered a line that for many Americans would encapsulate FDR's 12 years in the Oval Office.
This is a day of national consecration, and I am certain that on this day my fellow Americans expect that on my induction into the presidency, I will address them with a candor and a decision which the present situation of our people impels. So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance.
And so now returning to the story of the disciples in the boat with Jesus, afraid for their lives as the storm raged. I thought about how much Lynn and I love to tour lighthouses. One of the very best trips we ever took was a full day-long tour of all the lighthouses around Green Bay. We got to see just how the lightkeepers lived, and we were acquainted with what a difficult and important job it was to tend the light so that the ships navigating the treacherous waters around the bay would not crash and sink. In the old days, before electricity, we learned that the light had to be fueled by whale blubber. I imagined myself trying to hoist vats full of whale blubber up steep and winding stairs into the tower in order to keep the light burning. Yuck, what hard work. I wonder if you're familiar with what's known as the most famous lighthouse picture ever taken. It's been featured on posters and calendars throughout the world. I even had a copy of the print hanging in my own office for a while. The photographer was Jean Giraud, who was flying in a helicopter in 1989, tracking a storm of which he hoped to get some dramatic pictures. The dramatic image the photographer captured is of La Jumente Lighthouse being engulfed by a monster wave. You can almost feel the tremendous power of the water as it surrounds the tower. And then a closer look reveals a man standing in the doorway. When he heard the sound of Giraud's helicopter, the lighthouse keeper in the picture had gone outside to see if it was a rescue copter, which he was hoping for. When he realized it wasn't, he hurried back inside just as the wave was breaking over the lighthouse, avoiding certain death. The tower stood, and the keeper survived, safe inside. As we face our new year, we have no idea what storms lie ahead of us, emotional, financial, physical, or others. What we do know is that God will be there to protect and carry us through them. He is our strong tower, and in him is our refuge. Psalm 61:3 says, "For you have been my refuge, a strong tower against the foe." You know, the Bible says that there will be no sea in heaven. That's what Revelation 21 says. Sometimes that verse makes me sad. I enjoy warm beaches and surfboards and crashing waves and boating. What could be more picturesque and pleasant than watching the waves? There are a few good reasons why John's vision in Revelation mentions that there won't be any sea in heaven from a theological point of view. In ancient times, the sea was a place of chaos and evil. Loved ones died in shipwrecks. Enemies arrived in foreign-looking vessels. No sonar system plunged the depths and analyzed strange creatures that lived below the surface. The sea was a place of fear and dread. No sea means no fear. No more danger, death, or destruction. No more enemies or uncertainty. Can you imagine life without fear? Another observation about leaving the sea behind in heaven is the promise that there'll be no more separation from God. Recall how the Red Sea stood between the Israelites of the Exodus and their safety and their freedom. In Revelation 21, the barrier of the sea no longer exists. We'll no longer stand at a distance, separated by time and space from the throne of God. One more important observation to make about the vision that there is no more sea in heaven is that over the centuries, the ocean has kept the nations apart from one another. Even with all our modern technology, the sea still separates superpowers. China, Russia, and Australia might as well be in another world. They don't seem real to us because it takes so long to get there. And at the end of the ages, the sea will no longer separate people into groups. Isaiah chapter 11 says it well. God will raise a banner for the nations and gather the exiles of Israel. God will assemble the scattered people of Judah from the four quarters of the earth. In the vision of the fulfillment of God's acceptable day in the Bible, we won't be Americans or British or Russian or Saudi Arabian. Those who follow Christ will belong to God's kingdom. We will stand together shoulder to shoulder with people from every nation and every era with no barriers of difference between us. Jesus calms the sea in the gospel lesson that we have focused on today, and he means to comfort all the faithful with the promise that living in Christ can calm any emotional or spiritual storms which rock our personal and cultural boats of well-being. And that would be all, except for one more thing. I found myself thinking about the Titanic ship as I wrote the message for today. No, it was not a storm, but rather an iceberg which sunk that great ship. It probably captured my imagination because, a replica of the ship is moored right downtown in Branson, Missouri. It's a great museum that you should visit if you haven't done so already. All human life was aboard the Titanic. Its passengers were millionaires and penniless immigrants, the rich from New York and London, and the poor from every corner of Europe, men and women who were capable of facing death calmly, and others who would do anything to stay alive. In the real-life drama of the story of Titanic, we can see both the potential for heroism as well as the prospect of self-centered failure of character in the human psyche. Here's a vignette of some of those for whom the tragic event brought out the best in them. In the catastrophic event from our history of the Titanic, just like other catastrophic events from the headlines in our past, like 9/11 or the terrible tsunamis of Japan in 2011 and Thailand in 2004, in them there's an element of chance in who lives and who dies. A decision made in a split second can mean the difference between life and death. What was unique about Titanic was that hundreds consciously chose to die as a matter of honor. Some of the passengers faced their fears with great courage. Some of the people on the sinking ship decided to let others go to safety first, before themselves. They chose to take quite a literal plunge into the depths of certain demise. The difference, I believe, between the brave and the fearful is a spirit. They may or may not have named the Spirit as God's Spirit, but we know that that's what it is. And God's Spirit can embolden us for this fearful time too, just as it did the first disciples, in order to face every peril for the love of Christ. Fear not, friends in Christ, and don't ever forget, that Jesus is in the boat.